Hi, I'm Max Bergman.
And I'm Donatien Rui.
And this is The Eurofile, a podcast where we look at Europe through a Washington lens. Happy New Year and welcome to the first Eurofile episode of the year. Today, we discuss Trump's recent comments about Greenland, Elon Musk's power in the new administration, and the broader view of how European leaders are engaging with Trump before the inauguration. Then we will be joined by Jeremy Cliffe, editorial director and senior fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, to discuss the German elections and Europe's preparation for the return of Donald Trump. We hope you enjoy the show. Today, we have a special guest, our man on the ground, our mole inside here at CSIS that can tell us all the things that are happening in Copenhagen, our dear producer, Otto Svensson, who hails from Copenhagen. So, Otto, we're recording now what is the last week of the Biden administration on January 13th. The last few weeks have been dominated by Donald Trump talking about how he wants Greenland, how Greenland should become part of America for U.S. national security. And I'm curious how this is being reacted to in Denmark and in Copenhagen, and what's your kind of broader sense of Donald Trump's overtures? We sort of joked about it during the first Trump term. It became a joke that Trump wanted to buy Greenland. Feels a bit more serious now.
Yeah, there's definitely a sense of déjà vu going back to 2019 when Trump first made these assertions about wanting to do a deal with Denmark, basically viewing Greenland as a big real estate deal that he could sort of include into territorial United States. In Copenhagen, this was unexpected. The overtures in 2019, kind of at the end of the administration, there was a feeling that it was a little rushed. It wasn't totally thought through and perhaps just one of the whims of, an administration that was on its way out. And there wasn't sort of serious concerted effort behind the push. Now things are totally different. I don't think anyone was expecting this to come up before the inauguration, for it to be sort of a defining thing on the foreign policy agenda in the pre-inauguration phase of the new administration. And there's serious sort of thought and consideration behind this. This isn't just Trump mouthing off on Truth Social. You have incoming National Security Advisor Mike Waltz coming out and basically backing Trump up in Trump's claim that control and ownership of Greenland is an absolute necessity for national security reasons. Very absolutist terms. Mike Waltz came out and said, this is not just about Greenland. This is about deterring Russia. This is about critical minerals. It's about the Arctic as a whole. So in Copenhagen, there's real consternation. I'd say there's mild panic about what are we going to do this time? And it's not seen as just some fleeting moment on the Trump foreign policy agenda.
So taking aside some of the more absolutist claims and shiny nature of this whole debate, I'm curious for both of you, your thoughts on the merit. Stripping away the complicated debates around Trump and the people in his orbit, and obviously very complicated relationship between Greenland and Copenhagen. When you hear things like it is important to U.S. national security, is that a credible claim?
I think it boils down to three reasons. I think it's Greenland's geostrategic position. It's about military geography. The shortest way for an intercontinental ballistic missile to travel from Russia to the continental United States would be over the North Pole and Greenland. And for that reason, the U.S. has had an early warning radar system in northwestern Greenland since the Cold War, Pituffik Space Base, which used to be the Tula Air Base. And that's a totally legitimate claim. Second of all, Greenland has plentiful deposits of critical minerals. If you look at the EU's list of what it deems to be critical minerals to the EU, just as an example, 35 critical minerals are listed on that list. 24 of them are prevalent in Greenland. There's also oil fields that haven't been explored. It's sort of uncertain what the economic feasibility of those unexplored oil fields are. There's gas reserves as well. And then I think third and finally, and this sort of plays directly into the Trump administration's security and foreign policy agenda, is deterring China, Russia to a lesser extent. That's sort of a hotter topic in DC these days. China has throughout the past 10 years made overtures towards infrastructure projects in Greenland as well. There was a bid to take over a former Danish naval base, bids to invest in the expansion of Greenland's international airport. And those were sort of deterred through skillful diplomacy between Copenhagen and Washington, D.C. Those are all totally legitimate national security concerns, considering how close Greenland is to territorial United States. I think what has sort of been left out of the U.S. discourse on this issue is plenty of progress has already been made on those three issues, and much more progress can still be made within the current bilateral relationship between the U.S. and Greenland and U.S. and Denmark. I think the fact that there's currently one U.S. space base in northwestern Greenland, both Copenhagen and Greenland, there would would be plenty of appetite to have more bases, more military presence for the US in Greenland. You see that in 2024, Greenland announced their first security and foreign policy strategy, this big strategy document that's supposed to chart a new path forward for the territory. They're welcoming a greater US presence militarily on Greenland. And that can totally be achieved within the current relationship. The same can be said for critical minerals. In 2019, a new agreement was struck between the US and Greenland to further enhance the relationship when it comes to exploration of critical minerals. And lastly, when it comes to China, there's no significant Russian presence. We can set that aside for a sec. The only Chinese presence on the territory right now is some migrant workers, primarily working in the fisheries industry. And Copenhagen and Washington have successfully been able to push out China to the extent that there's not really any appetite left for China to sort of establish a foothold in Greenland. And again, these are all areas where both Copenhagen and Nuuk would welcome more US engagement, but it's not going to be through the US integrating Greenland as a part of the United States.
Max, I want to bring you in. Also, for the sake of argument, is there anything to address those national security concerns that would be done with some kind of closer Greenland-US relationship that can't currently be done within NATO?
I mean, I guess conceivably, but I think you mentioned the key acronym, NATO, that this idea that the United States must have Greenland become part of the United States for our national security, I just think is on its face not true, because we have this NATO alliance of which Greenland is covered, is protected. So there's an attack on Greenland or Chinese vessels or Russian vessels, then the alliance is obligated to come to its defense under Article 5. And the fact that Denmark is an ally means that we don't really have to worry about this, right? I mean, we can worry about it, but worry about it in the sense of like, hey, Denmark, you got a problem here. And then if like Denmark wasn't doing anything about it or was deeply problematic or was acting like the Hungarians vis-a-vis the Chinese or like Turkey, and yeah, the problem could then escalate. But what we have here is one of the strongest partners of the United States in Denmark, one of the most pro-American countries inside of the European Union and NATO. The future Trump administration, or Donald Trump, is picking a fight with, just seems completely unnecessary. To go back to a point that Otto made, that this has been thought through, and I think that may be true. The question is this just sending a message to Europe? Is this really not so much about the actual territory of Greenland, but to really send a message to NATO and the alliance that, you know, this is a different dynamic where here you have the United States seeking the territory of an ally, and yet the understanding of the NATO alliance is that the United States would come to the defense of an ally's territory, not try to take that ally's territory. And I think it highlights the potential for a more predatory United States in the world, a more sort of 19th century approach to global politics, of which alliances are things that evolve and aren't necessarily ironclad the way that we've seen the NATO alliance. I think this may be sort of a harbinger to something bigger, also maybe just about setting a predicate, not just about NATO, but also upcoming trade and tariff fights. And I think this should sort of raise the hairs on the neck of Europeans that think that this is going to be a business as usual Trump administration. I think where they got to at the end of Trump 1 in talking about Greenland and other things is sort of where they're going to pick up on. And that's going to be a very different administration that we saw the first time around.
And I think that we veer then into what I think is about to become a national sport here in DC, which is reading the tea leaves on the Trump administration. How serious are they about XYZ? And in this case, how serious are they about this kind of claim? We heard similar things with Panama. So that's also something that Europeans, I'm sure, are very concerned about is what should we believe? What should we actually put work into? Or is it a waste of time?
But that said, I think this has to be taken very seriously. And I think this is very serious. It may be a negotiating tactic, but when Donald Trump Jr. flies into Greenland, Fox News has been talking about how wouldn't it be great if Greenland became part of the United States? And so, Otto, I guess I'm curious how you think Copenhagen and Denmark is going to react to this. When I was going to pick, which country was Donald Trump going to get in a fight with first in Europe, I wouldn't have picked Denmark. But, Denmark, the sort of bullseye is on you all. And I'm curious how you think this is going to kind of shape Danish politics or Denmark's outlook going forward, and especially towards the Trump administration.
Yeah, first of all, I think it makes total sense for Donald Trump to pick on Denmark as one of the first sort of European targets. You're not dealing with France or Germany's, country that has real political power in Europe and could really sort of assert itself in the European Commission when it comes to, striking back with tariffs, for example. You have a very small country in Northern Europe that happens to have this massive territory affiliated with them that is a big bullseye in the eyes of Donald Trump. And you can kind of bully and have your way with a smaller European country, particularly a country that the US has a trade deficit with, and that hasn't until recently been contributing its fair share when it comes to defense spending. So I think that makes total sense. I would love to tell you that the reaction in Copenhagen to this will be to invest in a stronger Europe, greater European integration, comes to defense, something along the lines of a Scandinavian version of French strategic autonomy. That is not happening. The relationship with the US is so ingrained in Danish strategic culture among the officials working at the MFA and the MOD. So much of our security and foreign policy is tied up to the relationship with the United States. It's an incredibly delicate situation for the officials in Copenhagen who have to strike this very delicate balance, not to, pour gasoline on the fire and sort of try to temper the flames of what's happening in DC. At the same time, dealing with a government, a public sentiment in Greenland that is very pro-independence, that does not want to be Danish. I think that's important to make clear, is that they are a part of the Kingdom of Denmark. They do not want to be Danish. And Copenhagen is committed to that independence trajectory. So it's an incredibly delicate dance that they have to conduct between trying to keep the US at bay and at the same time not sort of make the delicate situation with the government in Nuuk any worse as well.
Has this sort of inspired or triggered kind of a more nationalist reaction inside of Denmark of, perhaps Greenland was going in an independent direction, everyone sort of agreed with that, but now how dare you try to take our territory? Has there sort of been a national response to Trump's call?
Yeah, in some corners. It hasn't made its way to the prime minister or any of the government's official statements. They're very much still towing the line that Greenland's future is up for the people of Greenland to decide. Those decisions will not be made in Copenhagen, which I think is smart. I think less is more in this situation. I don't think you want to make any inflammatory comments. I think if we look back to the 2019 situation, I think some lessons have been learned because the prime minister was very quick out the gates when Trump floated the idea of buying Greenland from Denmark. She called the idea absurd, and that was then taken up by Trump, saying that was a very nasty comment by the female prime minister of Denmark, and he canceled the state visit. We had an audience with the Queen that fell through. It turned into a whole diplomatic debacle. So I think Copenhagen has learned from that situation, and they're trying to say as little as possible.
Well, I think we should pivot to Elon Musk. So I'll give one plug to the great Danish show Borgen, where one of the seasons is devoted to Danish-Greenland relations. I think what we're seeing also with Greenland, directly applies to Elon Musk and his sort of entry into European politics quite aggressively. Over the Christmas period, he's been tweeting nonstop about far-right figures in the UK, like Tommy Robinson, picking fights with Keir Starmer, and then, surprisingly, Nigel Farage of the Reform Party, who, the party that he apparently backs, threatening to maybe enter into UK politics very aggressively by putting in a lot of money. And he's, of course, also just hosted the lead candidate for the AfD in the German elections for an interview on his platform X. And this is leading to all sorts of consternation about what to do when the world's richest man looks like a far-right reactionary coming to upset European politics. Dinetian, what do you think about what's happening and how the Europeans are reacting?
First off, I think Europeans didn't need that this year. I think there's more than enough to deal with in the coming months and years. But regardless, they have to deal with this now. As you said, it's not that Musk is picking one thing. He's starting to make comments about a lot of different aspects of politics across Europe. You mentioned he did an interview on X with Alice Weidel, who is the leader of the AfD. He endorsed the AfD in December, also online. So, we continue to see the growing influence of his platform and his use of the X platform for political purposes. But what's important to say as well is that it's not just political comments. Elon Musk has massive economic interests in Europe and in this relationship. Per Euractiv, Tesla has 15% of the market share in electric vehicles in the EU. There's discussions in Italy that we're starting to hear about on a link with Starlink for satellite communications for the government, which creates a lot of problems for an attempted project that the EU is investing in. So my concern with the picture that is starting to be painted here is the commingling of these political and economic interests that Elon Musk represents, which he did in the US during the election as well. He decided to just go forward and pull all his weight behind Donald Trump and now is clearly trying to reap the benefits of doing something like this. And we're starting to see potentially, and I think that's where Europeans should be pretty worried, is when there is some kind of economic action being taken toward one of Musk's companies. So X is already under scrutiny by the Commission for potential infringement around content moderation requirements for the big, Digital Markets Act, Digital Services Act legislation that have been passed, potentially election-related content infringement with this interview with Alice Weidel. The risk we're seeing now is that when there is action taken from the EU side towards his economic interests, there may be political and or defense retaliation from the Trump administration once it comes in. And J.D. Vance said something to that effect around, allies in the EU, or obviously through NATO, and whether we will defend people, if they hurt our economic interests. And that I find really concerning because that's what we saw in other countries in Europe even, is that mixing of economic and political interests and almost like a corporatist approach to things gets very murky.
I think what we're sort of seeing is just utter European fecklessness, I have to say also, in approaching the new Trump administration. And I think in some ways it's understandable. Trump's not yet president. We're recording the week before the inauguration, still the Biden administration. I think particularly in the UK, Starmer doesn't really want to get into it with Elon Musk because, they want to preserve the special relationship. The EU, Tesla's there. And do we want to start off a new Trump administration by immediately banning Twitter and then having that be a big fight? And, we'll just sort of sit on our hands. And Denmark doesn't want to anger Trump too much. And so we're not going to react that strongly to him saying that he's going to seize and buy territory and that he will sanction Legos and other things like that. As World War II broke out, there was what was called the phony war for the first 9 months, at least in Western Europe, where the UK and France were at war with Nazi Germany, but no one was doing anything. And it kind of feels like what we're entering. We're sort of in this phony war where Trump and his allies are throwing bombs at the Europeans. And the Europeans are like, well, just hopefully there won't be a war. And I just think the clash and collision is coming. And that unless the Europeans really stand up for themselves on almost everything, then the Trump administration will constantly take more and ask for more and demand more. So the Europeans have to respond to X. I mean, it's violating EU law. Does EU law mean anything? If not, then why would other companies, when it comes to climate laws, when it comes to other things, comply with the Commission if they think that the Commission or Europeans will back down? So the EU kind of has to take action. So the fight's going to happen. And you can either sort of run from that or you can confront it. And I think that's all going to get tied up on the security conversation as well. And a new sort of post-American world is really, I think, coming for Europe because there's just going to be collision after collision, whether it's on NATO, climate, tech, Greenland. And I think the best place that we could get to from a transatlantic relationship is if we have a short, quick fight early. And then hopefully that creates a degree of détente. And we saw that a little bit in the first term where the Commission did retaliatory tariffs. They stood up. And then there was kind of a détente in the trade war. Europeans don't quite have their ducks in a row. And it's understandable because, there's a German election that we're going to talk to Jeremy Cliffe about. I think it's fine that Meloni and others are going to Mar-a-Lago, but there probably needs to be a concerted European game plan of how you're going to manage the coming collisions with the Trump administration. And instead of just trying to pretend they're not going to happen, they're going to happen. So they need to sort of plot a strategy. And the U.S. should also be thinking about how we want to kind of manage these. And I would say we should manage them in a way that doesn't lead them to destroying the transatlantic relationship.
I agree 100%. The head in the sand strategy is going nowhere fast. I think the additional challenge to what you stated just now for Brussels is that all of these dynamics, especially related to Musk's interests, but definitely coming collisions on things like climate, are getting caught in what feels to me like a cycle of rethinking in Brussels about some of these huge laws that they've passed over the last few years. And the rubber is hitting the road now on the DMA, the DSA, CBAM as well, coming into force. That's the carbon border adjustment mechanism for climate reasons. All of these laws that are massive and have very serious implications for how all of these industries have been running their businesses so far, especially on the tech side, which has faced very little regulation since it's really grown. It's really starting to come into force. And Brussels and member states are looking at this thinking, okay, we took a really big shot here and we're not sure now that it's coming into force that this was the best way to do this, or that we have the right tools for enforcement, or once again, which is the usual US complaint, are we targeting American companies for almost everything? And for climate regulation is going to be the same. The taxonomy is super complicated. I mean, the burden of compliance is very heavy. So I think the additional challenge is getting caught in Brussels at a moment where they pass these laws and they have to enforce them. But some parts of Europe are thinking, oh, should we rethink this? And it's not the right time for this.
Well, I think think there, in some ways, does need to be a rethinking, but you need to do it with the kind of member states and everyone sort of buying in on here's our strategy. It's unfortunate Ursula von der Leyen had a bad case of pneumonia and wasn't able to go to Mar-a-Lago and sort of been somewhat MIA. We wish her the best in her recovery, but as we're talking about sickness, it's probably a good transition to our interview with Jeremy Cliffe and the situation in Germany. We are thrilled to welcome Jeremy Cliffe to the Europhile. Jeremy is the editorial director and senior fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations and is based in Berlin. He leads the editorial team and oversees ECFR's publications and writes on the politics and geopolitics of European sovereignty as part of the European Power Program. He has previously spent 8 years at The Economist, where he wrote the Baguette and Charlemagne columns and served as the bureau chief in Berlin and Brussels. And he is the co-host of an exciting new podcast called Searching for Deutschland, which is a new podcast from ECFR. The podcast is in English, and it's going to be about Germany's role in Europe, and it should come out very soon. Jeremy, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me and for that very kind plug for our podcast.
Jeremy, you are sitting in Berlin. You're a longtime watcher of all things Europe and European politics. Germany's having elections in late February. The elections have looked fairly stable, with the CDU roughly around 30%, the AfD in second place now hovering around 20%, and a little bit of movement with the SPD around 15%, and the Greens starting to elevate a little bit, I think up to 13%, at least according to the current polling averages, and a few other parties now at the cutoff threshold around 5-6%, with the FDP and with the BSW, the new sort of left-right party. So how do things stand? I think most people look at this election and just sort of project it out another 6 to 8 weeks and think it will be very stable. But in 2021, there was actually a lot of movement, with the Greens leading at some point, and then the CDU leading most of the way, and the SPD sort of coming in at the end. Do you think there'll be a similar kind of level of movement in the next 6 to 8 weeks of this campaign?
I think there's a reasonable chance of that. As you say, Max, in 2021, we saw Olaf Scholz's Social Democrats perform a remarkable catch-up and overtake of the Christian Democrats on the centre-right. And certainly the SPD and Scholz himself are hoping that they can pull off the same thing again. But also back in 2005, when Angela Merkel became Chancellor, she was way ahead of the Social Democrats at the start of the campaign. But Gerhard Schröder, then the SPD Chancellor, narrowed the gap to almost touching distance, which is one of the reasons why they ended up in that grand coalition that sort of spanned the center after that. So, German election campaigns have form when it comes to volatility. Voters, as in the US, only really kind of turn on to the choice as the vote nears. German election campaigns are in any case much shorter than American ones. This one has come about unexpectedly early. Most people thought it would be in September, but of course, Scholz's three-party coalition collapsed the day after the US presidential election. And so it's perfectly possible that something will shift. And the question is, if so, what? Could it be that voters see Friedrich Merz, the CDU, the Christian Democrat Chancellor candidate, as the front runner and rally around him, pushing the CDU up in the polls? Is it that they turn back to Scholz? I mean, Scholz is fighting a campaign very much around trying to play on German fears of war, German fears about their security. He's trying to sort of tread a middle path on Ukraine between what he would portray as the hawkishness of Merz and the Greens on the one hand, and the sort of Kremlin-pleasing policies of the AfD, the far-right party, on the other. Maybe that will come off. It's also just about conceivable that the Greens will see their numbers improve. I mean, they have a very charismatic chancellor candidate in Robert Habeck, currently the vice-chancellor and economy minister. He's seen as a very charming, telegenic, thoughtful figure. That said, the Greens have been held responsible for many of the more unpopular policies of this coalition. So all sorts of things are possible. We're also seeing the AfD ticking up by a few points amid general fears about security, terrorism, migration. They have, for the first time, a sort of a chancellor candidate of their own in Alice Weidel, who will get a lot of prominence, not just thanks to the owner of Tesla and X, but in the German media as well. So it's going to be a really interesting few weeks.
You were touching a little bit on some of the issues that were coming up during this campaign, but what are the key issues? I mean, from the outside, it strikes me that Germany basically having zero economic growth, now being sort of frequently labeled the quote-unquote sick man of Europe economically, would be a big issue, and particularly the kind of existence of the German debt brake, which caps what Germany can spend. It's essentially a balanced budget amendment. We've talked a lot about that on the show. What are the big issues, and how are various candidates approaching the kind of economic question?
Yeah, and it really is the big issue. I mean, the country has had 2 years of recession, possibly 3 soon. Its industrial output has fallen by about 1/5 since before the pandemic. The whole German business model built around, famously cheap energy from Russia and exports to China and others has come under enormous strain. But the different parties are approaching that in different ways. Christian Democrats are going big on tax cuts, largely unfunded tax cuts, it has to be said, and what they're calling an Agenda 2030, which is a deliberate attempt to echo Gerhard Schröder's Agenda 2010 reforms that liberalized the labor market in the 2000s with some success. And the SPD, Scholz, is going more on the idea of economic security, so pensions, upholding the welfare state at a time when people feel insecure. The Greens obviously standing by their belief that Germany can only remake its model through a faster transition to zero carbon technology. And the AfD, on the other hand, running a very sort of anti-greenery camp, blaming Germany's economic woes on its turn away from fossil fuels, from nuclear power, its sort of what they would consider sort of woke economic policies. So you get all different flavors of answer to Germany's economic trouble. Quite which resonates most with voters remains to be seen. But what is frustrating, I think, from the point of view of someone like you and me who sees the debt brake as a real problem for Germany, this sort of fetishistic aversion to borrowing for investment, I'm not convinced it's going to play a huge role in the campaign. Sadly, I would like to see it do so, but it's not, revising it is not a major part of any of the major parties' programs. That's not to say I don't think that some sort of reform or revision or bending of the debt brake at least won't come under the new government. And in fact, I can even see a Merz chancellorship, kind of Nixon goes to China style, being the ones to do so. It takes the centre right to overhaul a fiscally hawkish fiscal rule. Earlier on in this campaign, I was hoping that there might be a more fundamental debate about the way Germany invests, or in many cases doesn't invest, in its competitiveness, in its productivity. I'm not convinced we're going to get that, sadly.
So I want to dive a little deeper on Merz, if we can. You talked about what the party is representing, the issues that it's fighting for in this campaign. But I feel like, at least in English language press, everything we're getting on the election, I feel like I'm getting a split screen on Friedrich Merz and what he's trying to do. One, there's this narrative around he's very pro-Ukraine. He wants to support Europe, European security. But the policies that the party seems to be putting on the table during this campaign, I don't see how long-term that supports a unified and powerful, competitive Europe without those investments, without a change in the German economic model, or at least Germany not constantly digging its heels on, joint borrowing, or at least addressing the Chinese economic dynamics, let's call them, differently.
Yeah, it's a really good question. My ECFR colleague Jana Pülerin and I wrote a piece about this where we talk about what we call the three pillars of Merzianism, because he is a man of many different shades politically and in terms of his foreign policy outlooks. So as we see it, the first is a sort of a genuine romantic, sentimental commitment to Europe. I mean, he was the protege of Wolfgang Schäuble, who is remembered as the scourge of Southern Europe during the Eurozone crisis, but was actually, a former federalist. I mean, he just happened to believe that Europe should be one of concentric circles with sort of France and Germany driving things forward. But he was hugely influential on Merz. Merz was in the European Parliament before he joined the Bundestag in the early 90s when it came to be the European Union as we know it today. Even more recently, I mean, I was surprised sort of looking through some of his speeches and his writing from more recent times to find, for example, that Merz co-authored in 2018 with Jürgen Habermas, sort of the ultimate sort of European progressive federalist, a call for a more united Europe with a European army, a European unemployment insurance scheme, European wages and prices policies. So there is a genuinely pro-European Merz. And you see him coming to the surface now as well. I mean, he did an event actually also on that fateful day after the US presidential election when the coalition was collapsing a few blocks away across Berlin. He was on stage with Enrico Letta, the former Italian prime minister, who just had recently published a very ambitious report about the European single market and how to integrate it more closely. And the two agreed, a great deal. So to have a supposedly steely German Christian Democrat on stage with an Italian centre-left technocrat talking about the need to integrate European telecoms, the need to integrate European energy, defence, and so on and so forth, was quite striking. So that's the first pillar. Second pillar is Atlanticism. I mean, he is more, I think, emotionally committed to a close transatlantic relationship than possibly, if he becomes Chancellor, any of his predecessors. He led the German board of BlackRock, US investment giant. He's also run Atlantic Brücke, which is a campaign group pushing for closer German-US relations, speaks really very good English. He even now kind of will identify a lack of European Atlanticism as a problem in the era of Trump, which is quite unusual among many Europeans who want to talk more about European sovereignty and loosening the relationship. He says if we'd only done TTIP, that transatlantic trade and investment partnership, we would be better insulated against Trump's tariffs. So that's the second pillar, is Atlanticism. And the third pillar is what we've called a sort of Germany first mentality, which is much more than about Merz. It's sort of where the zeitgeist in Germany is. It's much more inward looking, much more focused on a sort of narrow definition of German interests. and less willing to make long-term investments in the greater good of transatlantic partnership or European integration. And you see it coming from Merz. He can be quite gaffe-prone. He's talked about Ukrainian migrants or refugees in Germany as social tourists, dismissed young men from migrant backgrounds as little pashas, derogatory term. He has rejected kind of closer European fiscal integration, including Eurobonds, and major parts of Mario Draghi's report on European competitiveness, which was the partner report to Letters, and called for a sort of 800 billion euro investment drive. And so the paradox with Merz is that you have these three pillars. You have this Europeanism, this transatlanticism, and this Germany first approach. And it doesn't take a seasoned expert in German politics to see that there are obvious tensions between those. Obviously between Germany first and the other two, but actually also in times of Trump, possibly between his Atlanticism and his Europeanism, because there will be topics where Trump may force Europe to choose between closer cooperation as opposed to sort of a more bilateralization of relations with the US. So what a Merz chancellorship brings, I think, will depend on the interaction between those pillars.
Yeah, can I just follow up on that? I think that's a really excellent way for me to think about Merz chancellorship. But then it strikes me the coalition partner is really critical in sort of pushing in a various direction, where if it's the Greens, I would see in a very European direction, SPD, perhaps a more inward direction, and then the prospects of an AFD, which I think they've ruled out, but we'll see how the FD does. But what about the coalition partners? I mean, right now, if the polling is as it is, and the election were over right now, you couldn't have a majority coalition with just the CDU in either the SPD or the Greens. You'd probably have to pick both of them. How do you see the coalition dynamics playing out here?
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, we can definitely rule out a coalition or any sort of cooperation with the AFD. It's true that the so-called cordon sanitaire is breaking down in a lot of Europe, with radical right either propping up governments or entering governments, most likely leading the next Austrian government after the election there. But in Germany, it does remain pretty solid. There's been a couple of low-level cases of cooperation in the local government in the eastern states where the AFD is strongest, but it definitely hasn't moved up to the state or federal level. It wouldn't happen after this election. As concerns the other coalition options, I mean, on the current polling, CDU might just be able to manage a coalition with one other party, because you don't need to get 50% of the vote in Germany to get 50% of the seats, because as you mentioned, Max, there's a 5% cutoff. So any parties that get less than 5% don't get represented in the Bundestag. So effectively, you can usually get a majority in the Bundestag with about 46, 47% of the vote. Obviously, it depends on the overall arithmetic. So he could just about do a deal with the SPD or the Greens, which I think is a choice he would like to have, because, of course, gives him more leverage to be able to kind of play them off against each other. But those coalitions would obviously look quite different. You know, the SPD trying to tread a middle line on Ukraine, that was what Scholz was trying to do with this phone call with Vladimir Putin back in November. It was him saying that he can broker talks, that he can support Ukraine on the one hand, but push both sides towards the negotiating table. So I think there would be more tension when it came to policies on Ukraine, perhaps also defense, where the SPD is traditionally a bit more dovish. The Greens, on the other hand, I think would align quite closely with the CDU on those foreign policy issues, very resolute in sort of more maximal support of Ukraine, for example, sending Taurus missiles. Robert Habeck, Green Chancellor candidate, has spoken of increasing German defense spending from around 2% of GDP now to not just 3, but 3.5%, which is a big opening to the CDU. But the CDU have also protested vehemently against green economic policies and want to roll back many of those. They're also very far from the Greens on migration. Greens obviously being more liberal. Merz has trodden quite a tough line on that to try and win back voters from the AFD. So those two different coalitions, if he can pull off a two-party coalition, would have quite different hues. I think from a sort of transatlanticist point of view, arguably a so-called black green, so a CDU green government, would be more in line with sort of established opinion in DC, whatever that looks like these days, but potentially with the SPD might be a bit more ambitious on the European stage. It's not quite clear. And then, of course, there's the possibility, as you say, Max, that they don't manage to form a coalition with just one, but have to form another three-party government, whether that's with both of those two parties, so black, red, green, or bringing the FDP, this sort of pro-business liberal party, as a junior partner, if they stay in the Bundestag, that is, and don't fall below the 5%. It has to be said that the outgoing government, or the now collapsed coalition of the Social Democrats, the Greens, and the Free Democrats, was not a happy experience. When it came together in 2021, some of us, myself included, were somewhat optimistic that it might somehow bring together the strengths of those three parties, the sort of the sense of social cohesion and social, stability of the SPD, with a sort of environmentalist modernism of the Greens, with a kind of pro kind of enterprise sensibility of the Free Democrats. And in many respects, it often felt like the complete opposite, like we were getting the worst elements of the three parties. The fundamental issue was that they tried to kind of paper over their differences with money, particularly with a large sort of off-balance sheet spending pot inherited from the COVID times when the Constitutional Court in 2023 ruled that they couldn't use that money for a lot of their programs. Essentially, that paper was sort of burnt away and they were left the real differences between those three parties. It wasn't a good experience. And I think as much as possible, if Merz is the presumed sort of chancellor to be after the election, he will try and avoid another three-party act.
I want to take a broader angle now, with Germany being our prompt still. If Merz is chancellor, which is very likely, I think we can all agree, what's your view on the prospect of a Trump-Merz relationship? Because I think we're all aware of the relationship Trump had with Angela Merkel, which was not positive. The people around him, you mentioned earlier, the head of Tesla and X does not have very kind things to say about Scholz or even the president, Steinmeier. So what's your view on what Merz is likely to be able to do with Trump? And then we can talk a little bit after that about Europe more broadly coming into this next Trump administration.
Yeah, I mean, Merz has said that he wants to do deals with Trump. One presumes on deals to avoid tariffs because Germany's export-led economy would be very highly exposed to sweeping Trumpian tariffs. And, you know, as we've discussed, it's already in great difficulty and this would add to that. And I mean, one can imagine that the two might get on personally better than Trump and Merkel did. Merz is a sort of thrusting, tall, older white guy, which one imagines might appeal to Trump in a way that Merkel as a female leader didn't. But I mean, my own perception of sort of the leaders that Trump did and didn't get on with in his first term was that these interpersonal questions didn't matter anything like as much some of us thought it would at the start of his first presidency, and it came down much more to interests and just what Trump wanted to do. So you've got to wonder whether that will make much of a difference. I think that this question of what Merz might get out of Trump is part of a bigger question facing Europe as a whole, which is, does Europe stand together when dealing with the Trump administration, or do leaders seek kind of case-by-case deals? Do they all rush to the White House and try and charm him in the way that, for example, Theresa May did when he first came to the then British Prime Minister? And, you know, we have obviously seen leaders of the radical right already beat a path to the door of Mar-a-Lago. Viktor Orban, Giorgia Meloni, the Italian Prime Minister, just in the last weeks. And, you know, whether then you see Merz make his own trip over there, try and forge some sort of relationship, try and push Trump in the direction of some sort of special deals for Germany is an open question. But I mean, my view, and I've written about this as well in the last weeks, is that you will see two forces unleashed in Europe simultaneously by the new Trump administration. Centripetal, so spinning Europeans inwards and towards each other, and centrifugal, so spinning them outwards. And there's a tendency in some of the commentary, I think, to assume that it's one or the other, that either Trump will fragment and shatter Europe, or he will rally Europe together in a moment of proclaiming European sovereignty. And I think we have to get used to the idea that he will do both at the same time, and that these forces will be in contest probably over the whole course of his presidency. And you've seen both in play in the last weeks. Yes, you've seen individual leaders, particularly those of Trump's political bent or thereabouts, rush to the US to buddy up with him. Yes, you've seen disputes over things like what Europe does on Ukraine. I mean, you know, Scholz's call with Putin pretty much completely uncoordinated with Paris or Warsaw. But you've also seen leaders coming together, proclaiming greater ambition on defense investments, on European economic security, on that European competitiveness agenda. You know, we've mentioned now the letter and the Draghi reports. And I don't think that is just rhetoric either. I think to see at the NATO summit in The Hague this June, probably a meaningful commitment to 3% of GDP in defence spending from the European allies, for example. The European Commission has committed to publishing a white paper on defence in the first 100 days. It's already taken office under Ursula von der Leyen again. And that I expect to be ambitious. It might open the door to common borrowing in order to fund European defence, using the EU budget to fund defence. You are seeing at the same time Trump posing the risk of fracturing Europe. Elon Musk having his conversations with Alice Weidel, firing up voters against sort of mainstream leaders, but also this new sense of direction and purpose.
It strikes me that Europe has been desperate for German leadership. And that's, I think, probably been the case for the last 15 years or since the Euro crisis. And they're consistently turning to Berlin. And, you know, you could argue Merkel sort of held Europe together. On the other hand, I think, you know, the kind of slow response to the Euro crisis led many here in Washington to be sort of exasperated at the lack of German leadership in Europe. But it strikes me that they're just kind of looking for a direction. So if Merz comes in and says, no, we need to just bend the knee to Trump and we just need to, you know, roll back all this EU regulation that the Americans don't like and just capitulate, I think that will sort of carry the day. On the other hand, if Merz is like, no, we need to chart this sort of new Draghi-esque course, I think Europe will largely follow. Do you sort of see that? I mean, is there a sense in Germany that this is an actually very profound election and that the winner, should Merz win, there's a real potential to sort of drive Europe in a certain direction? Or is that sort of not part of the kind of current debate? It's sort of just talked about by think tankers like you and I.
This is my third election where I'm in Berlin and following things closely on the ground. And what struck me at the last two in 2017 and 2021 was that outside of Germany, everyone saw the election through a whole Europe lens. Will this mean that Europe steps up more in the Eurozone, in the EU? Will it provide more leadership? Where will it steer Europe? What does this coalition or that coalition mean for Germany as the great keystone state, the anchor state of Europe? And then within the country, that perception just wasn't there. I mean, it's not to say that foreign policy didn't come up. There were points when foreign policy issues bubbled to the surface in the television debates, for example, but to a much, much sort of lesser degree. It's often said that kind of Germany is an awkward middle size within Europe. The old saying goes, too big for Europe, too small for the world. But even within Europe, it's not big enough to completely dominate, but also too big to be just one of the others. I mean, arguably, that is the essence of the German question in European history. And it remains true today. And I think yet again, we have an election where Europe urgently needs German leadership. I think Merz, with his sort of romantic Europeanism, will lean towards that point. As we talk on the 14th of January, he's about to host a kind of meeting of other centre-right European heads of government in Berlin on the weekend. He's giving a foreign policy speech next week in which he proclaims a sort of his Europeanism. So I think you will get elements of that. But in the substance, no. I mean, as you say, in the discussion of Eurobonds, what becomes of the European budget? I mean, the EU has to negotiate a whole new budget from 2028, and the kind of the build up to that is already happening. Questions like enlargement, which is in practice back on the table as an agenda item in Brussels, meaningfully expanding kind of European defence integration, they're just not big topics. And I think this speaks to, again, a slightly wider point, which is the sort of decline of the old Franco-German motor. For decades, it was the partnership between Paris and initially Bonn and then Berlin that drove the European project forward. And it has been in difficulty in the past, but I don't think at any point quite as moribund as it has been in the last years. Initially, because Germany didn't respond to Emmanuel Macron's bid for a new push on sort of European sovereignty, European integration, and now simply because the two leaders are themselves so weak. Emmanuel Macron failing now time and again to form a stable government, and Olaf Scholz, a lame duck, and actually not as engaged or ambitious in Europe, even as Angela Merkel, some would say. And so that engine is so broken. I've kind of pondered this as well in recent weeks. Is there some way that Merz or even Scholz in some different sort of government configuration, if something drastic happens in the next few weeks, can sort of overcome that? I'm not sure. I mean, French politics will remain uncertain for probably next few years. And then you just have the reality as well that the Franco-German partnership is no longer as dominant within Europe as it was. Europe is wider. Europe is more plural. I put a lot of hope in the so-called Weimar Triangle, which is France, Germany, and Poland. And indeed, the three foreign ministers of those countries are expected to travel to Washington together, which I think is another one of those centripetal moments of Europeans pulling together in the aftermath of the inauguration. But I mean, I've read another piece recently kind of actually calling for a slightly larger core bloc within the EU that probably takes in Spain and Italy too, just because I think you need the sort of steering committee of the EU, if you want to call it that, to have a certain economic weight. I think these days as well, given Europe's demographic future, given the security challenges, it also needs to have a southern dimension. Rome and Madrid would bring that. So these things are never quite formalized, as sort of institutions. But I think some sort of agreement between the big states of the EU to pull together and to come to compromises. Europe has often moved forward in the past through grand bargains. I mean, that was the essence of the Maastricht moment in 1992, where the EU came into being. The road to the euro was laid, the Eurozone currency. That was a great compromise, particularly between France and Germany. I think we need some sort of grand bargain where every country agrees to take some pain and every country gets some gain. The overall result is greater than some of its parts.
Jeremy, it's been a real pleasure to have you on. Predicting the future of European politics is always challenging. I think back to a piece that I wrote, I think in May of 2022, right after I started at CSIS, that was completely wrong. That sort of pointed to that kind of new pro-European leadership with, Scholz in Germany, Macron in France, Draghi in Italy, Sanchez in Spain, and then a few months later, Draghi's no longer there. This sort of pro-European moment quickly faded. So we shall see what will happen with a new German election.
Let me briefly say, I think sometimes it takes Americans to sort of make Europeans realize, or to remind Europeans of the potential they have to pull together and achieve more than they currently are. It's funny that sometimes it's those from the outside who have the greatest optimism about the project.
But as Europeans, we don't like to acknowledge that. We don't like to say the Americans made us do this. It's not
Please
great.
Don't tell any Europeans I said this.
No, well, I mean, part of what I was pushing the Biden administration to use its influence to push Europe more together. And we'll see how the Trump administration approaches Europe. It may really push Europe together, perhaps in a slightly more hostile, less congenial way than the Biden administration. But Jeremy, great to have you on. We'll be watching the German elections closely, and congrats on the new podcast, Searching for Deutschland, which comes out on January 17th. So please check that out.
Thank you very much.
That's it for today's episode. As always, if you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. You may also be interested in our sister podcast, Russian Roulette, which covers the latest on Vladimir Putin's Russia and the ongoing war in Ukraine. Our thanks to our producer, Shannon Young, and to Otto Svensson and Essie Pikkonen for coordinating and researching this episode. We'll be back soon with another assessment of Europe through a Washington lens. Until next time.